Hi and welcome to week 4, Psychology 2. We're going to look at the continuation on chapter 2 and we're going to focus on intelligence. We're going to look at what is it, some theories about it, and we'll look at intelligent testing, and then we'll touch also on creativity. And as I mentioned in the beginning of last week's video, I mentioned about Wendy and the Williams syndrome and her condition and Kim Peek. And this whole topic of intelligence is kind of surprising because in a sense we think we understand it, and yet we have different examples of, if you've ever seen savants, if you look up on YouTube Stephen Whitshire, you'll see an example of somebody with a particularly enormous skill set and yet having other weaknesses in other areas. So what is intelligence? And how do we measure it? And do we even measure it accurately? Because do we even really know what it is? Let's find out. By definition, we can look at intelligence as an individual's ability to understand complex ideas, to adapt effectively to the environment, to learn from experience, and to engage in a variety or various forms of reasoning, to overcome obstacles by taking thought. And so it's a rather broad definition of what is intelligence. But if we look at some of the direction that research has developed over time about intelligence, we'd start with Spearman. He developed what he called the G factor. And Spearman's term for general intelligence, an ability that underlies all mental operations to some degree. People who are bright in one area tend to be bright in others. The S factors, these were specific intellectual abilities. Spearman's influence seen in intelligence tests such as the Stanford Binet that yield one IQ score to indicate the level of general intelligence. Now he was one of the initial researchers into this area of intelligence, but he wasn't the only. When we look at Thurstone's 7 relatively distinct capabilities that singly or in combination are involved in all intellectual activities, and he called these primary mental abilities. And they included verbal comprehension, numerical ability, spatial relations, perceptual speed, word fluency, memory, reasoning. All intellectual activities involve one or more of these areas and believe that a single IQ score obscures more than it reveals, suggesting a profile indicating strong and weak areas. And so we're seeing right off in the get-go a sort of disparity around IQ scoring. On the one hand, Spearman is saying everything can be captured in one score, and here on the other, Thurstone is saying, you know what, if you go only into one score, you're likely losing some of the capability of an individual by having just one score. It needs to be something that's done on a broader scale. Now, someone who explored on a broader scale in more recent time is Howard Gardner, and he has what he calls the 8 frames of mind. It's less focused on factors that underlie intelligence, and it focuses more on the type of intelligences, and developed the theory by studying patients with different types of brain damage affecting some form of intelligence, but leaving others intact. And the savant syndrome, as I mentioned, Stephen Whitshire as an example, he studied a lot of people like him, and where they had a combination of mentally handicappedness and unusual talents and ability. And Stephen Whitshire is an example where he has an outstanding and incredible memory. What he's capable of doing is going up in a helicopter over a city he's never been to, spend 45 minutes going around the city in the air, and then spend a week drawing by memory in extreme detail every aspect of what he saw. And when they go back and check, he's 95% accurate in detail based on just from his memory. And there's lots of examples of savants. Believes all forms of intelligence are equally important. That one isn't more important than the other. In fact, each has their own skill set. Cultures assign varying degrees of importance to the type of intelligence. So some, because of where they are geographically and where people live, will find some intelligence will be much more important and valuable than in other cultures where other forms of intelligence might be more important. Various abilities and skills have been valued differently in cultures and periods of history. Now Sternberg, he had the triarchic theory of intelligence, and he divided intelligence into three parts: componential, experimental, and contextual. Componential was more like the analytical, book-smart version of intelligence. Someone who was able to learn details and repeat facts and recover those sorts of information was very smart in that form. Whereas experimental was more of the intelligence that was related to creativity, insights, where you would do a lot of divergent thinking, which would mean that you go from an idea and stretch out and go beyond the perimeters to see where this will lead you. Whereas contextual would be someone who would have more common sense. Now, common sense is a bit of a misnomer, that if it was common, everybody would have it. But clearly, if you drive, you know that some people just don't have common sense. So it was considered the street smart, the person who would be good on their feet and maybe not really strong book smart, and maybe not necessarily highly creative, but they would be able to survive on the street. Not literally necessarily, but that was the kind of smarts that they had. Argued that IQ test performances and real-world successes are based on two different types of knowledge. There was the formal academic knowledge, and there was the tactile knowledge, the sort of hands-on. So there are some people who are really smart by using their brains for reading and comprehending complex ideas, and there's others that can show their smarts through the way that they maneuver things and taking action and using their hands. And so you're seeing a variety of different sort of strategies by which intelligence is being looked at. There isn't a real clear definition or a real clear theory on how it is that intelligence exists. But Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale, he, through another researcher, Thurstone, perfected the intelligence quotient, or the IQ, and published the Stanford Binet scale with items adapted for American children. And there's been various versions. I think we're up to about the 6th version. And it's individually administered IQ tests for people between the ages of 2 and 23 to give an overall IQ score. Now, when you do testing, there are norms. And norms are really like the standard of expectation. Here's the standard way that you deliver the test. You don't vary what you say. You don't vary the order in which you do it. They're done with lots of different people. They're done in exactly the same way, and therefore they're more able to be compared from person to person and from individual to individual, because they've been delivered in a standard norms-based way. Now, the IQ is an index of intelligence originally derived by dividing mental age by chronological age, and then multiplying by 100. Now derived by comparing an individual score with the scores of others of the same age. And he had 4 subcategories here: verbal reasoning, quantitative reasoning, abstract visual reasoning, and short-term memory. And there'd be a series of testing. You'd have a testing kit, and a person who was trained in delivering the test in this standardized way would then be giving these test activities to an individual, and then based on the results would be able to give them an IQ score. Now, the intelligence test that's used a little more now among adults in particular, but there's also a child's version. There's the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, or the WAIS. It's first successful individual test for adults. Historically, they had been with the Stanford Binet, which is largely for children. It's widely used psychological tool. Its score is based on how much an individual deviates from the average score of adults, not on the mental or chronological ages. Compares verbal and performance, which is the nonverbal subtest, and it's administered by one person at a time by a psychologist or an educational diagnostician. And so intelligence tests are, questionable in terms of their overall reliability, but there is a method by which tests are screened to ensure that they are as good as it's going to get for now. So when we look at how they arrange tests, the requirements of having a good test, it starts with reliability. Reliability is the ability of the test to yield nearly the same results from the same people who are tested and then retested on the same test or an alternative form of the test. So if I were to test all of you and then a week later give you the same test, you should get over each time a relatively similar response, and that would make the test reliable. That if it went all over the board, how reliable is the test? The second is validity, and this is the ability of the test to measure what it's supposed to measure. So if I'm giving you an intelligence test, but it really, if I'm telling you it's an intelligence test, but it really just tests motor skills, well, maybe I'm not giving you a very valid test. If I'm going to measure intelligence, it's got to be able to measure intelligence. So you need to know what intelligence is, and you need to be able to create activities and questions that measure that specifically, and that would make it valid. It needs to be standardized. Standardized means it's got established norms. Norms just mean way of doing things. It has to be able to do them exactly the same way each time. I've seen when the test has been administered, the person asks the question in exactly the same way. They don't answer questions, they just repeat the question, and everybody gets the same opportunity in exactly the same way. That standardized set of norms for comparing scores of people who take the test in the future, and a set of procedures for administering it. So that helps make it a more reliable, valid, and standardized test. And then what they found through the Stanford Binet early in its development was that it wasn't culturally fair. Tests would be given to students or children who were not white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant, and would find that they would score worse because they didn't have the experiences of these other children. So it wasn't very culturally fair. So the culturally fair intelligence test uses questions that will not penalize those whose cultures differ from the mainstream or dominant culture. When those conditions are met, then it's the best that we've got given those sets of circumstances that we have. So requirements of a good test, we can also look at the bell curve. And the bell curve is a normal standardized curve. The majority of scores will cluster around the mean, around the middle. The further away from the mean scores, the fewer there are. And so it dissipates the further away you go. Less than 2% are classified as either geniuses or mentally handicapped. Now, if you look at the term mental retardation, now remember, we're reading from a US book and using US terms. In the United States, they still use the term mental retardation. In Canada, that's not a term that we use. We use mentally handicapped, developmentally delayed, but we don't use mental retardation. I'm using it here because it's in your text, and it would be easier to follow if you're doing your text work. Now, the definition is subnormal intelligence, which is reflected by an IQ score below 70, and by an adaptive functioning severely deficient for one's age. And it just means that the person has skills below what other people in their age would have. Now, it's important to note that even if you use the term mental retardation, that retardation means slower, it doesn't mean can't. And so when we look at this topic of intelligence, it's helpful to have a broader definition of intelligence for the number of people who might fall in this category, who may not have an IQ score that's very high, but may have other areas of competency that separate them from others in a more positive way. And so in the field of mental disability, inclusion or mainstreaming became very popular in the 70s and the 80s and has continued to grow. And this is educating mentally handicapped people in regular rather than special classes, placing them in regular classes for part of the day, having special classrooms, relying more heavily on behavior modification techniques, and encouraging them to be more a part of the everyday life experience and learn from everyday life experiences. Now, one of the areas that has been taking some particular interest in the area of intelligence is that of emotional intelligence. Employers have been saying for many years now that they cannot teach emotional intelligence. They can teach you to be smarter on the job, but learning how to cope with who you are and with each other is emotional intelligence. It refers to a set of capabilities that are separate from IQ, but necessary for success in life, in the workplace, in intimate personal relationships, and in social interactions. It's the ability to apply knowledge about emotions to everyday life. Argues that emotional intelligence is just as important to outcome variables as regular IQ tests. Personal aspects of emotional intelligence includes awareness of emotions, management of emotions. Does not mean suppressing emotions. Means having the interpersonal aspects of emotional intelligence includes empathy, sensitivity to others' feelings and ability to read others' nonverbal behaviors, managing relationships, to manage and give and take in social relationships, to manage your own feelings and to be sensitive to others. Being able to have a fight and work with that person the next day. That is to solve it positively and be able to continue a working relationship, not burn bridges. And this is what's become very important. And it's another area of intelligence that is now being looked at is this more important? How do we measure this? Now when we look at creativity, it's sort of, is this part of intelligence? Is it connected? Creativity is the ability to produce original, appropriate, and valuable ideas and their solutions to problems. It can be defined as an accomplishment born of intense study, long reflection, persistence, and interest. Now, there could be, can creativity be taught? And it's arguable that it can be. And it's actually not that some people are creative and others are not. It's that do we give ourselves permission to understand how to be creative? And so the first of 4 stages in terms of creative problem solving would be preparation. And preparation is the searching for information to help solve a problem. So sometimes before you can start to solve a problem, you have to know what the problem is and find out what information you can to clarify what that problem is. And then you need to incubate. Let the problem sit a moment. Let the relevant information digest. Allow it to have a chance to percolate, if you will. The third stage is illumination, being suddenly struck by the right solution. In some cases, it's just about being aware. It's not that some people aren't creative, they just aren't aware that that creative moment has just arrived. It's being aware and writing it down and start working on it. And then fourth is translation, also known in some cases in some literature as verification. This is where, did this idea transform the insight into some sort of useful action? There's very weak to moderate correlation between creativity and IQ. Correlation just means that 2 things occur at the same time, but they may not be a cause and effect. So it suggests there's weak to very moderate cause and effect about creativity and IQ. That is to say, it's not that connected. High intelligence does not necessarily mean high creativity. Genuine creativity rarely appears in sudden flashes. It usually appears because of hard work. And lastly, looking at 2 forms, if you will, of creative thinking, we can look at divergent thinking, and I touched on that briefly previously, and convergent thinking. Divergent thinking is the ability to produce multiple ideas, answers, or solutions to a problem which there's no agreed upon solution. Just being, here's your problem, and you can come up with a half a dozen or a dozen possibilities outside of that problem. It requires fluency. It requires the ability to formulate ideas without limitations. It involves a high degree of divergent thinking demonstrated by creative thinkers is flexible, switching quickly and smoothly from one stream of thought and set of ideas to another. Both brain hemispheres are highly active during creative thinking, and that's divergent. It takes the idea and goes out, here's an idea, here's another idea. Whereas convergent thinking consists of solving precisely defined logical problems for which there is a known correct answer. Math, as an example. The type of mental activity measured by IQ for achievement tests, it just demonstrates a greater activity in the left frontal cortex. Convergent thinking says that there's a solution. Here's the creative way to get to that solution. It presupposes there's an answer. All right, I hope this has been helpful. I hope you will use your intelligence, your cognition, and your language to go on to be successful in your career choice. Good luck, everybody.